Welcome back to Two Nobodies, everyone. I'm Rupesh Patel. Today we have a really interesting guest, and if you haven't seen the Human Microbiome episode with Dr. Emma Allen-Vercoe, I encourage you to see it because I think this one's going to tie in some degree, shape, or form, and I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. Our guest today is Dr. Wade Abbott. He's a research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and I think we're talking about sushi cows. Is that what's happening today, Wade?
I'm sure that'll come up at some point, yeah.
Well, welcome to Two Nobodies. Really glad to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to ask you first, how was your Halloween? Because you sent me an interesting, it looks like you dressed up as Wolverine. I'm kind of curious about that. How did that go?
Well, thanks for leading with that. I can apologize for this poor excuse for a beard. We decided to go as superheroes this year. So my wife dressed up as Storm, and I was Wolverine. So I don't think they're love interests, but it was both X-Men, and we had a lot of fun with it, actually. I can't remember the last time I got so into a Halloween costume. It's probably for trick-or-treating, I think. But it was a lot of fun. I grew the beard out. I'm at the point where I'm like, let's keep it going. Maybe I can actually grow one of these now. So.
Then it just gets kind of gross and disgusting, and then you have to trim it back.
Yeah, no, I don't know if we're at that point yet, but we'll see if I can fill in the patches. It's alarming how much gray I have now, though. That's it's a disappointing thing.
Yeah. I'm starting to experience that now too. So I guess the costumes thing you said is not a regular occurrence. This was sort of a one-off.
No. We just we got invited out. I think part of it is maybe a response to being on lockdown for so long. And I've been working from home for 20 months. And so it's like every time we get a chance to do something now, I think we're just all over that. So, yeah, we got invited out and we got into it. And, we had a lot of fun. It was a good time.
How has the pandemic been for you?
Well, I think, looking back on it, I don't know if we all really know the impact of it, to be honest. But, personally, our kids are older. So our youngest is away at college. All three of our kids, are in university. Well, the oldest one's now working in the States. So it's like we're empty nesters. So we didn't have to deal with the home life aspect of lockdown, right? So we didn't have, the kids that we had to teach, and we weren't trying to do our job and
right.
Keep them entertained. So I think that gave us some reprieve. In the start, to be honest, we actually enjoyed it. I was working from home. My wife went back to university, and so she was taking online classes, and then we had all three of our kids at one point here. So it was a chance to be a family again. It's to me, it's gone on way too long. I realize how it's affected everybody differently. I think most of us are at the point now that, life's got to go on some way, somehow. And we're all waiting for this new normal. Who knows what that's going to look like? So, I guess I'm at the point where, I'm ready for the next chapter. It'd be great to start traveling again. I work this is my home office. So I've been here for 20 months.
Right.
My research group is back. So they've been back for quite some time. But that's one way to keep numbers down at our workplace is to have the managers, the scientists working from home remotely supervising. So, yeah, it's been long. I can't say it's been terrible, but I think like the rest of the population, I think ready to move on here at some point. So.
Have you initiated any sort of creative projects? Like for us, it was starting this podcast. Was there anything that you just took on that you probably wouldn't have?
That's a good question. There's a lot of time, especially in I'd say the first year, we had to reflect on kind of what we were doing and where we wanted to go. And so, most of my job really is glorified fundraising, writing research proposals. And that's, to be honest, I enjoy that. I like the challenge of coming up with new ideas to solve problems, right? And building teams and thinking of ways to tackle these issues. So that, working from home, things had slowed down quite a bit. It gave us a chance to really reflect on, okay, what's going well? Where do we want to go as a research program? And I think, so from that sense, from, the work sense, that's probably, I think, really helped us focus on, where we're going now. Personally, I guess it gave me a chance to focus a little bit on my health and we did a lot of running, got outside a lot. I think those are probably two of the main things for me.
Are you a long distance runner, or do you like the sort of high intensity sprints, or what sort of does it for you?
I would say it's more the distance, so I'm running about 10K now. I'm not breaking any land speed records, but I think the last time I was running like this was probably 13, 14 years ago. So it's quite a bit younger, lighter, fitter. So it's nice to kind of get back to those times and those distances that they're good benchmarks where you can really compare back. And it's funny now with my youngest son, who's an athlete, he sends me his updates on, his strength stuff. And he's like, oh boy, there's some things now he's surpassed.
What does he do? What's his sport?
He's a pitcher. He pitches, NCAA Div 1 pitcher down in Buffalo.
Oh, that's amazing.
So he's at Canisius College.
Okay.
Yeah, in his second year. And so, he sends me his strength test stuff, and there's already things he's crushing me at. But I'm holding out on a few. So bench, I still got him there. But it's funny, those, you get those milestones or those benchmarks, right? And you can really look back in time and see, okay, how was I doing when I was, 35 compared to now?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And where are you at right now? How old are you now?
47.
47. Okay. Yeah, so you're about 10 years older than me. Not too far off, I guess. But if you're out benching your son, that's pretty good, Wade.
I like to think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we got that on recording now. Your son's gonna probably cringe at that one.
Well, he's deadlifting over 400, so that's not even close.
Yeah.
And apparently,
apparently
that's what matters. It's not bench; it's deadlift is more important.
Yeah, I mean the deadlift is a more functional movement, but still, I mean bench is a tough exercise. It's tough to gain strength in that area, and it really works those shoulders not in a great way. So I think the fact that you're keeping up and outperforming a bench, I think that's pretty awesome, man.
I think we're down to days or weeks, though, from the sounds of the gains he's getting these days. So, but yeah.
How's your diet? Did that kind of fall by the wayside, or did you do pretty good with that?
I think it's funny. Like I said, with the kids older now, most nights it's two of us. We actually had our middle daughter move back home this semester. So some nights it's three of us, but we eat differently now, right? Like I just remember dinner time used to be craziness. Like get home from work, everyone's hungry. There's activity starting in like half an hour, an hour. We got to be across town. It's like, that was a way of life for just years. And then as the kids kind of all grow up, and then it's like things kind of slow down, and you can think about it. And so we're more careful about our carbs now. Like a lot of people, we're cutting down on some of the meat we choose to eat. And just trying to, I think, just make some simple choices, and seems to be paying off.
Does your research in any way inform the way you eat? I asked that of Emma in that podcast, and it was interesting to hear her diet. I'm curious if your research in any way has informed your diet.
I think it has to. If you believe what you're doing, right, it has to kind of affect what you choose to put in your body. And some people take it much more seriously. I've really been impressed with the conviction that some researchers have compared to me. But one thing that really changed was my appreciation for fiber, and I call fiber colon candy. So people don't really like that analogy as much, but are you getting the colon candy? It's that's what's feeding.
What's the issue with the analogy?
I think the word colon kind of makes people.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
it's like that's what feeds your microbiota, right? Is these this plant cell wall, dietary fiber, indigestible material, and that's what's getting converted to all those beneficial metabolites that get absorbed by your body. There's all the mechanical benefits as well. So it's like, okay, so we study this, we read this, we see paper after paper. So is it just cool science, or are we actually going to say, hey, I need to implement some of these dietary choices in what I'm doing. So I think that's the big one. It gave me an appreciation for how we were raised. My mom was really committed to gardening and lots of vegetables, lots of fiber. You don't really appreciate when you're a kid, but there's I think a lot of benefits, and we're trying to supplement, moving away from maybe lots of meat to more vegetables and fiber, and the hard one is the starches, right? Like that's really difficult to replace. If it's a pasta, rice or bread, like there's always those carbohydrates that are so tempting, and finding that the replacements that are going to fill you up, be tasty, look forward to eating. That's usually the challenge. So, it takes some balance, but I don't think you can go wrong with increasing the amount of fiber that you're consuming.
I find with carbs that if I really start eating some of those things that you just spoke of, then I kind of want them more, and then it's hard to kind of withdraw from that, and then you go through a really hard process of like, okay, I'm gonna, cut back on those things that might be maybe not helping you, and then you do all this work, but then as soon as you get that taste again, it just like comes in waves, and it just sets you back, especially if you have certain goals, fitness or body composition goals. It just kills you.
Yeah, and sugar is another one like that, right? And
yes.
You totally lose track. It's like you can keep eating this, it's I totally know what you're saying.
Do you think that in some ways, and I don't know if there's research on this or if to that, like let's say sugar, for instance, like is the microbiome involved in any way of once you've fed it enough sugar and it wants more, does the microbiome in any way sort of dictate or have an influence on that?
So the way I understand it, so the simple sugars is what we call sugar, right? So, table sugar, some of the simple carbohydrates, the sweet stuff, like those are actually absorbed by your body. You don't have to digest those. Some of the starches, for example, that's one of the main, I think, the only complex dietary carbohydrate that you can digest. If you digest starch, you release glucose, which is easily absorbed into your body. So this stuff is happening in the saliva, the pancreas, the small intestine is where those sugars get absorbed. They don't even reach the distal gut microbiota, right? So that relationship between simple sugar and sweet stuff and the distal gut, I'm not sure really what's going on there. I know there's gut-brain axes and all these things controlling the moods and your appetites, but the stuff that is feeding the microbiota is that fiber, those complex sugars in the plant cell wall, in the fungal cell, the mushrooms or seaweeds, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit about later.
Yeah.
So those complex sugars, we don't have the enzymes, right, to digest those, and so they transit through your intestinal tract intact. They reach the distal gut microbiota. Those microorganisms are loaded with digestive enzymes that specifically target these types of sugars, and that allows them to break them down, ferment them in the colon, which is an anaerobic environment. There's no oxygen there. So the fermentation by these different gut bugs is what creates these metabolites that are then absorbed by your body. So
interesting.
So there's a real you got to differentiate simple sugar from complex carbohydrates or fiber, because
the pathways are just very different. It sounds like.
Different, yeah. We don't have the enzymes to metabolize much more than starch and lactose. So
interesting. So now going into your research, maybe tell folks about how you got into research and then how you got into your certain, the areas that you want to focus on. Like, I'm curious about the wicked problems that you're interested in solving.
So yeah, how I got into research. Well, I was thinking back on this. So grade 12 was kind of an interesting year for me. I won this biology award, which actually meant a lot to me. Like I hadn't won many scholastic awards. If you looked at my GPA, you wouldn't think this guy's destined for greatness. But I did really well in biology. I won the award that year, and so I kind of floated around college, really looking for that inspiration of what I wanted to do. I was married young. I was married at 19. We had our first child at 20. Wow. Didn't end up in college. Well, I stayed in college. I was bouncing around. I ended up dropping out of college, actually. I spent a year and a half just reflecting on life. And there's lots of other stuff going on, as you can imagine. Young dad, young husband, some of the struggles of trying to find your way. And I really kind of had a life-changing experience. I became a Christian. I actually changed my whole outlook on life. And I decided, it's time to do something. I think it's going to mean something. Like I really wanted to make a difference. And that change actually is what inspired me to go back to school. It involved moving away. I got into Trinity Western University, which is in BC, and that started the path to where I ended up. And it wasn't like I knew I was going to be a scientist. It's like I just knew I wanted to go and learn and do something. And by the end of my undergrad, I decided, this science thing's not so bad. Reflecting back on my grade 12 award, I was really enjoying what I was doing in university for the first time. Decided to carry on. I got into graduate school, not with much foresight. So it was a real difficult transition for me, I have to say. I didn't have research experience. I hadn't done co-ops. So it was a really tough transition, but I was able to persevere. I had obviously a lot of support from my wife, and having 3 kids then in my Ph.D. was quite motivational for me.
So what age did you start your undergrad, and then kind of when did your next 2 kids kind of come to the picture?
So I graduated from my undergrad in 2000, and at that point we had actually our second daughter had just come along in the last semester. And then basically I graduated, I had a weekend, and I started graduate school. I moved home back to Victoria, started graduate school the following week. And it was my first year of my PhD that we had our third child. So we had 2 young ones, Maddie and Levi were 2 years apart, and Kaylee was a bit older at that point. She was like 6 or 7. But yeah, so we had the 3 kids during the PhD, and it's funny. I have a cousin of mine. Something he said to me when I graduated my PhD really meant a lot to me. I said, it's like it's really. I don't know how I was able to get this done with 3 kids. And he looked at me and he said, "It's because of those 3 kids. You were able to get it done." So.
What do you mean? That's interesting. What do you mean by that exactly?
The motivation, and that's what it was. You got to provide for these guys. You got to find a way. So anyway, that kind of helped spirit me through. I went on. I ended up doing 2 postdocs. One at University of Victoria with Al Boraston, and then I moved to the University of Georgia at the Complex Carbohydrate Research Centre, and I did a second postdoc there with Harry Gilbert. And these were some amazing times, scientifically, just really exciting. There was so much going on in the microbiome. I moved down to University of Georgia in 2008. I was there till 2010, and there was just some exciting science happening. And
you're studying the human microbiome at this time?
So all up that whole time, my whole graduate degree, my postdocs, I was studying human-based research, human health. I got into interactions with bacterial pathogens and the human host. When I went down to Georgia, that's when I started studying pathways involved in digestion in the gut. And it was really just at its infancy. And some of that work ended up being published in quite prestigious journals. Just the impact of those discoveries at that time, right, was really taking off. And so, all my training was on human health or human processes and how we interact with our microorganisms. So that was at the end of 2010. I moved back to Victoria. I was at the University of Victoria for 3 months. I started dabbling in some seaweed at that point. And we were looking for on the biofuel kind of application. I had my interview with Ag Canada. I was offered a position, and I started there April 2011. And so that's kind of another major crossroads, right? Where you land in a government job, you work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, all of a sudden you're working about food, like livestock. So I didn't have any experience. I didn't have much network. The funding is completely different than if you're at a university. So if you're at a university, usually you're going for your tri-council funds, those are your NSERCs, your CHR. So we're not eligible for that. So we go for other pots of money. So I had to learn that system. So it was a bit of a transition, but at the end of the day, I think it really was super beneficial to come in from the outside and to bring some different, approaches, some thoughts, some techniques, ways to tackle problems in agriculture. And I think that that's really paid off for how the program's grown. And the other nice thing is I have such a fantastic network for my time in universities, and I continue to get to work with some people I really respect and enjoy. And I think that's one of the neatest things about our job is that we build these relationships over the years. People go on, they start their own programs, and they're probably could be in Europe and Australia, the States, or parts of Canada. But you get to, work together on projects, or you get to meet at conferences and share your latest discoveries, and you have these really deep relationships that you built, in the trenches of the lab,
Right.
And now as we grow up and we pass the mantle of being in the lab to the younger generation that's a lot better than me at it, but still we get to maintain these relationships, and I think that that's really one of the most rewarding things about what I get to do.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. The first thing is just, we've already kind of had a little bit of discussion on this, but just incredible, Wade, that you were able to, you had your first kid really early, and then figuring sort of what your path is. And by the time you're starting your PhD, you have 3 kids. Like I can't even imagine the pressure in terms of, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. But what you would have felt because Kyle, my podcast partner on this, him and I have discussed this feeling that maybe men have of needing to provide and the pride that men take in that regard. And we discuss about whether that's something that, many men have, all men have, at what scale or level that is. So I'm curious about that. Because I can't imagine sort of what you would have felt during that time. Because if you're going into your PhD, I can't imagine, unless you're doing some part-time work, that there's really much income coming in. I don't really know about your wife's situation, but still can't imagine that it would have been very easy. And then I'm aware of what postdocs make, and it's okay, but it's not, it's not an incredible salary by any means, and you're working incredible hours. So. Yeah. What was that like, from just like a feeling of needing to provide and from a fatherhood and masculinity perspective?
So yeah, I think, coming from my generation too, I think there's, these thoughts and approaches to it are changing a bit, and how we view the workplace. But I know for me, what was modeled to me, a very hardworking dad, right? And hardworking mom too. But just, it's like, okay, that's, now you have kids. I think for me it changed when the kids came along, because up until then, I think my number one thing was playing football. That's all I wanted to do, was work out and play football.
Right.
And I thought that was pretty important, right? But then the kids come, and now somebody's depending on you, right? And so what are you going to do with your time? Everything kind of, your perspective changes. And I think that's just what's in us, right? And, until you have your kid, it's really difficult to convince people that that's something, that's going to happen to them too. For me, it's just, working through that season, some of it was that, there's an end, right? Like, you're working towards this goal. And the way I looked at it was, there's this huge pile of dirt, and I just got to move it from there to there, and then I'm done. So the faster I move it, the quicker I'm done. And so I really kind of threw myself into my work, and I found ways to get things done but still be involved in the family. So,
Right.
when things were crazy, I'd go to the lab at midnight and I'd work till 5, come home, eat breakfast, see the kids off to school, maybe have a nap, go back to the lab. Like finding ways like that, just to still be in the home, be present, but knowing that, there's this task in front of me, and until it's done, like things aren't going to change. So it was, I guess, workmanlike in its approach.
Yeah.
There's two types of people. I know there's probably more than that, but the way I look at it is there's like people that are just really good in the lab. Like everything they do works. They've got these magic hands, we call them, right? Or, people say, you gotta, do your dance to the research gods or whatever, right? So that things work. Like they just, everything they touch, just everything works out. Then there's like the uber intelligent people, like straight A's through school,
Right.
and they know everything, but they can't seem to can't seem to put two things together in the lab, right? So there's like I was more on like the I kind of knew what I had to do, but I didn't have great hands, and so I had to work and work and work and repeat things over and over again, and I think that didn't help the situation, but it's the way it was for me, and I just threw myself into it, and things actually went pretty quickly. I had 4.5 years to get my PhD, so
Mm.
part of that was on a good project. I was in a good lab. I had great support, but I think a lot of it too was choosing to work extremely hard and diligently to get it done. So you can move on, and then in research, that's the big question: is like, what do you move on to? And that that became little crises moments of their own is
Sure.
trying to find out, okay, well, where am I going to do a postdoc? Do I have to do a postdoc? How do I become a professor? Like that's what you're supposed
Right.
to
Because
be,
that's sort
right?
of the natural path, right? Is
Yeah,
you become a professor, but not everyone wants to have a blend of teaching and research. Some people just want to be research scientists, right? And
yeah, no, and yeah,
yeah,
exactly. There's a lot of other responsibilities that you don't get trained for
yeah,
in this line of work,
yeah.
and so anyway, like I said, I was fortunate. I had opportunities in two wonderful labs with Al and Harry, and that really set the stage. And they become your champions. These are the people that are
Mm-hmm.
writing letters and supporting you, as we struggle our way through, right? To get that body of work and to get those ideas that a university or a research institution is going to say, hey, we need to bring this person on board, and took me 6 years of postdocing. Doesn't take everyone that long, but that's how it went for me. And looking back, it's funny. I had a lot of interviews at a lot of different universities. I counted them up. There
Mm-hmm.
was 18 or something at one point,
Mm.
and and I just didn't get the offer. I wasn't the guy for the job, and for this reason or that reason. And it was a really difficult thing for me to deal with, especially with the family
Well, those
situation.
those interviews, like I when I was at the University of Waterloo, we'd see candidates kind of come in and explain their research to all the students, all the graduate students as part of their interview process. It's an experience, like it's intense,
It's
sort of
intense.
full day or two. And so you're saying you've done 18 of those,
It
like
was 15, 18.
that's draining.
States, Europe, throughout
Yeah,
Canada.
yeah,
And it's not just that. It's not just the 2 days that you see. It's the preparation that you're putting your
sure, yeah,
proposal together.
right.
Then if you're selected, you get on the short list, and sometimes there's a virtual pre-interview now, and then you get invited
Mm,
on campus to give your research talk. Sometimes you have to do a teaching lecture. Then you got to meet with the
mm,
grad students. You got to have one-on-ones. There's your panel interview with the faculty. It's absolutely draining.
mm,
Uh, but then consider, like, we're also people thinking of moving there. So in the background here, you're looking at, okay, well, where will my kids go to school? What's the real
sure,
estate market like?
yeah,
All these other things are going on. And so, and every interview is the same. So you go through this emotional just pressure cooker, and so it was really for me draining, and I was left wondering, is this even going to happen for me?
Yeah.
But looking back, I have to say, like the training that went into that, the time I spent as a postdoc, I think really prepared me to become an independent researcher. Sometimes you got to be careful what you wish for, and we want all these things we're just not ready for, and then you end up in a position that would just be overwhelming, right?
Sure.
And so, yeah, it sucked at the time. It took a long time. I had, incredible support from my wife and family, right? So, but yeah, looking back, I can't complain. And ending up in government, it was not what I had planned for. But, thinking about the way I work, the way I'm wired, we're more released from things like teaching and some of the other administrative burdens that you get at university. And I think there's more freedom to think about solutions and get ideas funded and really become creative in your science. So I think that's been a benefit to being where I am.
Well, first of all, congratulations on just, being able to get through that journey as you described it. And also, just as you also alluded to, being able to be present with your kids at the same time. Like, I think that sometimes those things get pushed to the side and I think we're increasingly becoming aware of how important the presence of parents and being mindful of that as parents is so important to a kid's development and the relationship with their parents and how they interact with society and friends going forward. So I'm sure it sounds like your kids would probably be very grateful for that. So congratulations on that. It's interesting also what dawned on me as you kind of spoken about your early journey is just the infancy in which the research on the human microbiome has been, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And that was something that Emma had also spoken of. And, something I had asked her was, has any of we hear about, for example, the fermentation of foods and why that would have occurred. And, the thought is that, well, it's one mechanism for obviously preserving your food, but there are also some thoughts that people think that in some ways they're also trying to feed their microbiota and their microbiome. And I asked Emma whether that had guided her research at all, because you have all this kind of historical lifestyle data that is now being tapped into, of looking at sort of like indigenous cultures and how they eat and studying their microbiome and if things have changed. But the fact that the scientific community has really, maybe it sounds like, started researching this only within the last 20-25 years is quite remarkable.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of it has just, I think, been a result of the technology and then the cost of the technique, right? So we can do things now in a few days that wasn't even possible for 15 years ago, for example. So I completely agree. And I think too that analogy you made about studying indigenous cultures, it's the same in agriculture, right? So there's a real curiosity in looking at wildlife and comparing it to how livestock, how they're raised, how the production setting, and comparing these two. Like we're feeding this artificial diet in order to get the best results, as far as meat and time of growth and all these things. But what about health? And if we're thinking about things like, are we trying to move away from antimicrobial use, for example? Is there more natural ways to actually, keep these animals healthy? So that's actually been something we've been thinking quite a bit about in our research. And another very interesting relationship is the mother baby nursing, and that natural food, right, that comes from mother to child, how that feeds the microbiota. And a big part of that is the immunity, but there's also the sugars that are in the milk that are specifically digested by bacteria that are in the gut of the baby. So you get this prebiotic effect that only happens from mother to child. So if you think about, okay, if that's a natural relationship, are we mimicking that in, animal production, for example? We're not. It's completely different. It's
completely removed.
artificial. Yeah. So except for maybe something, you think of cow-calf relationships. So something in the beef sector where the calf is born on farm and then they spend time with mom, they suckle. That's probably the closest. But some of these other systems, if you think about dairy or swine, there's big problems associated with in early life because they're not getting that natural relationship. So yeah, can we learn, from these things? I think so. And can we start to apply some of them to improve the health in natural ways, to move away from, the use of antimicrobials and other interventions that we've relied on?
That's really interesting. So maybe Wade is a good point to hear about the wicked problems that, you're currently focusing on or ideally would want to address.
So yeah, the big ones, well, actually, and this is recent, believe it or not. Well, it's recent to me. It's recent to a lot of people in my organization, and that's the renewed focus on climate change. And basically every research program has been challenged with, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to study, the flow of carbon, the change in climate? How can you make a difference? How are you uniquely positioned? How can you build on your research networks to actually study this with our goal of actually, returning to 40% of, emissions in 2005 or net zero by 2050.
By 2050, yeah.
Right. So these are radical changes. We're not talking about incremental changes here. So I think that is one of a wicked problem that's facing not just us, that's facing everyone, right? Like that's not going away. And so that's something I've kind of taken to heart and took a step back and said, okay, what do we do well? Well, we study sugars. We study how sugars are consumed by bacteria. But if you think about it, carbohydrates are carbon and water. So the flow of carbohydrates through agricultural systems, the creation of, primary productivity is the synthesis of sugars. And then how those sugars are turned over, how they go into the soil, how they're, consumed by microorganisms, the soil microbiome, how they're fed to livestock, turned into biomass, used for energy. All these things there's a huge factor there is the role of carbohydrates and how they're modified. So this is something that we've actually, started to focus more on with the goal here of studying ways we could potentially sequester carbon as carbohydrates in the soil. Is there ways that we can grow? Can we grow seaweed, for example, which grows extremely quickly, and then use that to replace other things in agriculture?
Like actively grow seaweed?
Yes. So commercially grow seaweed, because this sequesters a ton of carbon. It grows very quickly, and there's other benefits. They don't require fresh water, fertilizer, arable land, for example. So there's a solution where we can we can create carbohydrates in the ocean and then use them potentially in agricultural systems to solve other things, whether it's methane mitigation in ruminants, which is a huge area of research right now. Can we use these as potentially sustainable biofertilizers? Can we replace chemical fertilizers by using the minerals and the elements that are naturally occurring in seaweed? So this is just one example of where we can think about, let's look at this a different way. And, how can we use our particular expertise, to help contribute to solving some of these problems?
That's really interesting. So then what about, cattle that just eat grass? Like we had a conversation with somebody who's a regenerative farmer, and I don't know if you've heard of the research that was done. I think it was a farm in Georgia. I keep forgetting what the name is, but there was an independent consulting project that was done, and they found that farm, which was a cattle farm, was able and used regenerative practices, was actually sequestering carbon at the end of it, and it was because of just the process of time controlled grazing and eating grass and all that stuff. Is seaweed potentially more superior than like grass-fed cattle at potentially sequestering carbon, or am I misunderstanding something?
Well, there's there's massive potential with seaweed when we're talking about Asparagopsis taxiformis. So this is one species that grows mostly in Australia, but kind of in the Mediterranean as well. I think also in South America, from what I understand. So warmer climates. So there is this ability within this seaweed where there's an accumulation of some compounds, and these are haloforms, so like bromoforms and that. And they actually they inhibit the methanogenic pathway in methanogens that colonize the rumen. So they are a direct inhibitor of methanogenesis. So this is
does that mean that if it's a direct inhibitor that you would potentially produce less methane at the end of it?
Exactly. And we're talking low inclusion rates. Like this is a remarkable discovery. The first report was Rob Kinley. I believe when he was still in Canada. He's now down in Australia. And so they're actively growing this stuff. It's difficult to grow, which is part of the issue. And now you've got all the QC issues around keeping things the same, making sure there's the same amounts of bromoforms and that. So there's many challenges. And one of the biggest issues with seaweed, of course, is that it's coastal, right? So how do we get it from the ocean to where livestock production occurs? In Australia, it's not that big a deal because most of it's happening around the coast. You look at somewhere like Canada, most of that's happening in Alberta, Saskatchewan, right? So we now have to get that seaweed into the interior where the production's occurring. But regardless, there's some amazing innovation happening in that space. Can we inhibit methanogenesis directly? And that solves your methane problem. The other way to look at it, though, is that seaweed is a potential feed additive. Like you can replace different feeds. So most of what is fed to, apart from grass, but when we start to get into feedlots and winter, for example, most of what's fed to cattle is grain that was intended for human consumption, but is just not up to snuff, right? So the truth is, though, that food or that land could be dedicated to cultivating crops for human consumption, right? So if we can offset some of that with, seaweed, for example, there's a way to increase the efficiency of how we're using land to generate food.
So just so I understand this correctly, if the seaweed has some sort of microbe or microorganism that looks like it's inhibiting that sort of methane production pathway.
Well, it's a chemical, but yeah.
It's a chemical.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that only happens remarkably. It only happens in a couple of species that have been found. Now there is some other anti-methanogenic properties in seaweed that's been found. Some of them grow in Canada, some of them in the North Atlantic, and so there's other potential there. But that one I'm referring to, that only happens with Asparagopsis taxiformis and one of its relatives, Aromatis. So it's quite curious, right, how that discovery was made and the potential that's there. But other seaweeds that actually can be naturally harvested off, Canadian waters. There's other ways to use these in animal production and other forms of agriculture, whether it's for biofertilization, for example.
So that we're still studying to confirm whether the seaweed around Canadian coastal waters can also result in the same kind of methane inhibition.
Well, the research is suggesting that it's not to the same level, but there are other things. There is potential to reduce it some, and then we don't understand why. So that's where the research is going, is can we actually start to get down to the heart of the matter here and figure out, what are the differences between these two forms of inhibition? And that's one of the things that we're actually studying, and many other groups are studying that as well.
Do you have a sense of what farmers think about this, or different association groups that represent big cattle?
So it's funny. It's a good question. I think when you're closer to the waters, there's actually a little bit more awareness and even probably some historical practice. So we're actually collaborating with a farm out in Courtenay, BC, and they feed seaweed right off the beach to his cows, and he swears his cows are healthy It's an organic farm. They're not using antimicrobials. So there's those types of benefits. There's also the potential to use it as a feed source, which is something we're super interested in. And kind of actually what got me into seaweed for livestock production is it actually digested by microorganisms that live in the gut of cattle?
Mm-hmm.
And it is. I can say that we've now actually shown with multiple different seaweeds that there are microorganisms in the gut of cattle that are interacting with and digesting seaweeds. So that opens up a whole new opportunity, right, for it to be used as a feed, not just a methane inhibitor.
That's interesting that those cows would have the microbes to be able to process those things to begin with, right? Is that or is that or is that not really an interesting thing? I don't know. It sounds interesting to me.
The most interesting thing. That actually is what is fueling the whole research. Because the way we see it, and maybe you got some other ideas, or somebody listening to this podcast hopefully might have some other ideas. But the way we see it is there's three potential things that could be happening here. One is the microorganisms that live on the seaweed naturally in the ocean. They come along with the seaweed, they're consumed, and actually they continue the process of digestion in the rumen. Now, we don't think that's the case because the rumen is an extremely competitive microecosystem. It's anaerobic. These bugs that live in the ocean are aerobic, so it's not going to be conducive to them growing and competing within the rumen. So we don't think it's that. There's something else called the sushi factor, which was first a phrase coined by actually a good friend of mine. He works at the Max Planck Institute in Bremen, Germany now. We still collaborate, but they had a paper in 2010 called the sushi factor hypothesis, and what they noticed was that in Japanese populations there was an enrichment of enzymes that they also found in marine bacteria. So the gut bugs of these Japanese people had enzymes that they found in naturally occurring marine bacteria. And what do those enzymes do? They digest seaweed. So the sushi factor hypothesis is that there was a transfer of genetic material from marine bacteria into gut bacteria, and that endowed the bacteria in the gut with the ability to digest seaweeds. And there was a selective pressure because there's more seaweed being consumed, right, in that culture. So a really compelling hypothesis. They published it in Nature, and a lot of people really like that idea. Now we've got that's possible. That could be going on here too. But where we start to ask some more questions is this is happening in real time. You know what I mean? Like the digestion is happening as soon as you feed the seaweed. So that suggests that either the transfer of genetic material is happening like in the same time frame as antimicrobial resistance might occur. So if that happens, you would expect the genes coming from the bacteria in the ocean to be very, very similar, if not identical, to what you're finding in the gut bacteria, because that material is just transferring over. Immediately, the selection is there, and they start feeding on the seaweed. But we don't see that. We see a little bit of diversity and divergence in the sequence, which takes time, right? So that raises the third hypothesis, that potentially these microorganisms, these rumen-associated bacteria are there already, just at very low levels. So we don't see them unless we go hunting for them. But once you put them under selection, you give them that feed that only a few of them can consume. They start to proliferate now to levels that you can see them, you can isolate them out of there. So that's the third hypothesis. We don't have the answer, but it's really those ecological principles is what's driving this project, and we're so excited about trying to figure out which of those three it is. Because that has potential for other, you can think about if we have to start introducing new feedstocks, whether that's through the cycling of food waste or bioplastics, or use your imagination here, right? If there's potential there to start to target completely unique polysaccharide-based substrates, well, is the potential now in the rumen to digest them? And that opens up some amazing opportunities, I think, for just, the circular bioeconomy and the resilience of the sector. So,
yeah, no, that is very interesting. How do you, I don't know if this is a silly question, but how do you know if the cows are digesting the seaweed properly or not? Like, what would you look for?
well, typically, what you said, there's nutrition metrics. So you can look at things like gas production, ammonia,
Okay.
pH changes. You look at what happens to the animal, some gross metrics about weight gain. You look at methane, methane production. You look at digestibility. What we are particularly interested in is we can determine the structure of the seaweed. So we can actually track it because it's got unique chemical features that won't be in the rest of the diet. So we can actually track it through the different compartments right into the feces to look at, is it being consumed or not. We've also got some other, techniques that we've developed to look at, interactions between bacteria and these specialized polysaccharides. And it's quite clear. So some of this isn't published yet, so I don't want to go into too much detail. We hope to publish this stuff very soon, but we're convinced that these, there is digestion occurring, and we're just trying to figure out how and why.
Very interesting. Do we know if the nutritional profile of, like, so for example, that farmer who swears that his cows are healthier, do we have any indication whether the actual meat is any better or worse? Or
yeah, I'm convincing him he needs to give me a couple ribeyes, and I'll do the taste test. But he's convinced that they are, right? So
yeah, okay.
But that's the funny thing about farmers, right? Like they've got a way of doing things, and this isn't uncommon. Like for the East Coast, for example, there's a lot more seaweed production going out there, access to seaweed for people raising their cattle right on the coastline. Historically, throughout Northern Europe, this has been going on. There's the fascinating example of the Ronald Say sheep, which were abandoned from a ship on nothing but rocks and kelp, and these things survived hundreds of years, and they're there to this day. So, it's definitely possible, and it's a really cool area of science to be in.
I feel like we could keep talking about this because it is quite interesting. I did notice though, Wade, one of your other research interests, which I don't really understand, and maybe you can kind of dumb it down for people like me, is this area of glycomics. And apparently it's like this sort of up and coming thing, or maybe it's already been there, but I saw that there's governments are interested in this area and people are getting funded for this research into this area. Do you mind telling us about what that is?
So glycomics is the study of carbohydrates or glycans in a biological system. So it's like a general approach, that one might take to figure out, okay, what carbohydrates are there and how are they put together, for example. It's not that it's a new area of science. Like this has been going on, in particular in human health. So some of the techniques and instrumentation now is just unbelievable. It's like science fiction what they're doing now. But usually the focus there is trying to understand how disease happens and how do we fix it. Also in biomaterials. So there's been a lot of effort going into characterizing, structural fibers, how they're put together, how do we break them down in, an engineering plant. So I think we're excited about the opportunities that are arising now, as we call it agricultural glycomics. So taking some of these more advanced techniques and using them to study agricultural problems, whether it's a disease, whether it's digestion, like of a rare dietary element like seaweed, whether it's studying carbohydrates that the plant is secreting into the soil as it exudates to figure out how much carbon can we see being deposited in soil. So it's just that we're taking these approaches and applying them to new problems in the agricultural space where traditionally they haven't been.
Okay. Interesting. If you're okay, I wouldn't mind shifting to sort of the questions that we typically ask our guests, if you're okay. Hopefully you had a chance to look at them and think about them, and you're not being surprised by them. But if you're okay with that, the first question that we ask people is, dead or alive, who are 5 people that you would want to have dinner with?
Well, I got as number one Jesus Christ, because he's been
Okay.
the most influential person, I think, in the history of humanity,
Yeah.
and the way he approached his teaching is something that means a lot to me. From science is Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, germ theory of disease, vaccination, very relevant topics. Just what he was able to accomplish in his lifetime, it was remarkable. I've got Elon Musk, because I would like to pick his.
Elon Musk has been on a few people's lists, I must tell you.
Just want to pick his brain. Like, this guy seems to have
Yeah.
an idea for everything. So it'd be,
Yeah.
15 minutes with him might change your life, right?
Yeah.
The fourth one I got is Tom Brady, and here's a story
Okay.
of as a man, former barstool athlete that I am, is how he has defied time and performed at such a level.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
If you can bottle that, right? Like, he's a whether you like football, sports or not, like what he's been able to do and perform at that level in 2 different organizations now at his age is absolutely remarkable. So
100%. Yeah.
and this last
You're lucky that Kyle actually is not a fan of Tom Brady, and I think we had one guest early on who identified Tom Brady as part of their 5, and he was like, I respect the guy, but he's like, I hate him. And I think there's that thing with Tom Brady: you either really love him or you hate him. There's not really this kind of in between. I think.
Well, I'm sure if he was on his team, though, you'd probably love him, right?
Yeah,
you hate
sure.
him because he
Yeah.
wins. He just finds ways to beat you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then this fifth one, I actually was thinking quite a bit about this, and the fellow that I'd like to sit down and just kind of touch base with was that high school teacher in grade 12 that gave me my award. Just like, does he have any idea?
The imprint he's left, or yeah.
But I have to say, like, it did mean a lot to me at that time, right? And it's funny, you can
Right.
think about teachers that have a negative impact on your life or a positive impact on your life. And I think for him too, he might be interested to know that, hey, one of my former students actually, went on to a life in science. So I think that would be a fun conversation too.
Yeah, that's a fantastic list. I'm surprised you haven't. Is he? Do you know if he's still alive, or you have an opportunity to reach out to him?
I don't know, so I'm gonna have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting list. Who do you think you'd enjoy at that? Would you want these people in a group at the same time, or individual conversations?
Well, the one I wouldn't know about is Elon. Like, who knows what he's gonna say at the time? But
Yeah,
no, I think they're all kind of different, right? Like for different
yeah,
reasons. So I think they'd be different conversations, and probably just one-on-one. Like to sit down with them,
yeah.
and I'd have some questions.
Very cool. Last question. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
So my 5, I'll just rattle them off: are faith, family, fun, hard work does pay off, and this is one for the kids. Reference letters matter, and so leave a good impression. And this is actually a bit of a pet peeve: is when you work for somebody and then you only hit them up when you need a reference letter, like
Yeah.
keep in touch. Let your former supervisors know how you're doing, what you're doing. I think that goes a long way. So
Authentic relationships.
yeah,
Eh?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wade, this has been a pleasure. It's been really fun getting to understand your research a lot better. I know we had a conversation before we set this up, and I left feeling, how am I going to talk to this guy? Because I don't quite understand. This research is too above me, and I was a little nervous coming into this conversation, but I appreciate the way you kind of translated your research, and it is really, really fascinating. And I just appreciate your time today and giving me this opportunity to talk to you. and also just being vulnerable at the start and sharing sort of the struggles that you had to go through as a young dad and with a growing family of 3 and the challenges as an early researcher. I'm sure anyone who is experiencing that at this moment and listens to this podcast is probably going to benefit from that experience. So thank you for that. We're going to post, I'm going to post Wade's information in the show notes along with his bio and his research interests, and hopefully you guys like this episode. Wade, again, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you, Rupesh. Actually, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity and for you don't get a chance to talk about your story very often. So I really appreciate this opportunity a lot.
You bet. Okay, take care of yourself.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.